It's a pleasure to be here for the first time in actual meat space at Breaking Convention. What a marvelous conference you people have put up. And Eric Madden. What a tough act to follow. You know, I'm tempted, a true bard. I'm just tempted to say, cancel my talk. Let's listen to him for the next half hour. Truly amazing. So I'm humbled and I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about what's come to be known in sort of the mythopoeic lore of psychedelics as the experiment at La Chorrera. It was not an experiment, but it was an experience that certainly has had a profound impact on my life, on my brother's life, and possibly beyond that. So, my brother once said at some conference somewhere, we are part of a symbiotic relationship with something which disguises itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us. And yes, in the late 60s, my brother and I were immersed in the burgeoning psychedelic counterculture. But we were particularly obsessed with DMT, a psychedelic that was rare in those days. We were convinced that DMT was more than a drug. We thought it could be a portal to hyperspatial dimensions and possibly alien contact. We called it The Secret. In 1971, we set out for La Chorrera, a tiny mission village in the Colombian Amazon, together with 3 similarly obsessed friends. At tongue-in-cheek moments, we called ourselves the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. La Chorrera was the ancestral home of the Witoto people, who were rumored to possess an orally active form of DMT. At the time, the pharmacology of ayahuasca was not really understood, the importance of the admixture plants. This was an obscure hallucinogen psychedelic that was reputed to be orally active, and we thought the oral activity would prolong the effect and perhaps give us a chance to spend more time in this dimension, which we thought of as a dimension, and perhaps communicate with the little people reported by the Witoto shamans. What we were looking for was this, one of the Varroa species that's widely used in the Amazon to prepare psychedelic snuffs, but this was an orally active preparation. What we found when we got to La Chorrera was this, Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom, growing abundantly out of almost every cow pie. Our agendas and priorities quickly got rearranged. We started eating them almost casually until it became apparent that this was the real secret. This was the perfect orally active form of DMT. And it turned out that the mushroom teacher, as we came to call it, had a lot to teach us. We became completely convinced that the mushrooms themselves, or an extraterrestrial entity, were telepathically transmitting instructions to us, or more particularly to me. The mushrooms, if that's what they were downloading instructions, a blueprint to use sound mushrooms on our own DNA to transform ourselves into superconducting holographic hyperdimensional entities that were fusions of matter and mind, an artifact controlled by thought whose capabilities were limited only by the imagination. Essentially, the ultimate biotechnological artifact, the UFO, the Philosopher's Stone, the resurrection body, the logos externalized, the transcendental object at the end of time, which is what this experiment, had it succeeded, would have created. Well, of course, the experiment did not succeed because it could not. But it had a spectacular effect. I became dislocated in space-time for over 14 days. My consciousness became co-contiguous with the boundaries of space-time. Terence became hypervigilant and did not sleep for 14 days, in part over his concern about me. His lifelong program to drive his little brother crazy had finally succeeded. During that time, the elements of the time wave theory were downloaded to Terence, followed by a spectacular and utterly absurd UFO encounter, which I didn't witness because I was busy cruising the cosmos. All of this, of course, has been thoroughly documented or recounted in Terence's 1993 book, True Hallucinations, and in my 2012 book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. All still on Amazon. It's unpacked in detail in those two books, as well as our 1975 collaboration, The Invisible Landscape, which represents our mostly misguided efforts to explain what happened to us in scientific terms. Although there is no science that could explain this. Terence was 24 when we ventured to the Amazon. I was a mere lad of 20. The remainder of our lives have unfolded in the shadow of La Chorrera. We are haunted by the passing strangeness of the events that transpired in those mist-shrouded pastures. Terence passed on in 2000, still not having the answers to the overarching question. I soldier on and still ponder, what the hell happened to us? Was it a prolonged dual psychosis, a neurochemical imbalance triggered by our excessive and reckless ingestion of enormous quantities of potent psilocybin mushrooms? Was it a plunge into the abyss of shamanic reality, a rough initiation into the dimensions that shamans navigate daily? Or was it an encounter with alien intelligence, utterly real and yet originating from an alternate dimension, outside our ordinary conception of space and time? The fact that drugs were involved makes it tempting to dismiss it as delusion, and yet undeniably anomalous occurrences were witnessed by others not on drugs. And typical, if there is such a term for something like an alien encounter, typical alien encounters always have a signature that sets them apart from altered states or shamanic trance. There's a subtext that makes them seem deliberately designed to obfuscate and confuse, as though it, whatever it is sending the message, you think you're having an alien encounter, but it is much stranger than that. So I want to talk a little bit about some elements that many of these alien encounters have. They're not, I don't call them abductions, because they rarely are. They're more like just encounters with high strangeness. Occasionally, they're abductions, and if you think of that as being transported somewhere else. But some of the elements of alien encounters that we find in the experiment at La Chorrera can be sort of unpacked here. For one thing, there's very often, for the contactee or the victim or whatever you call it, or the blessed person, whoever this happens to, there's often a familial backstory that is related to childhood events or family trauma. In our case, we were anguished by our mother's death 6 months previously to the day. In childhood, our dad was not the average guy he pretended to be and insisted he was. He was an avid reader of science fiction and Fate magazine and introduced us to that dubious literature early on. Our fascination, there's often in alien encounters a siren song, something that inexplicably pulls the contactee into the encounter despite its terrifying nature. In this case, our fascination with DMT. Once we experienced it, nothing else mattered. We had to investigate it and abandoned our careers and studies to do so. The alien teacher, a non-human intelligence, not only seen but always sensed, with a message or information to share. This was also present once we got to La Chorrera and started eating mushrooms regularly. The teacher showed up and pretty much camped in our living room for the duration. We thought of it as the teacher, more like the alien who came to dinner, and most nights was dinner. As we lost time, another element of alien encounters. As we approached the moment to perform the experiment at La Chorrera, there was a concrescence of anomalous phenomena in the environment, a sense of time dilation as though approaching a singularity. We explained all this as a shock wave from the future. This was a predicted effect, confirmation that hours ahead we had performed the experiment and it had succeeded. After the experiment, time remained distorted for many days. I was lost in space-time. There was no now for me. I was smeared across all time. Terence was obsessively anchored in a timeless now. Our only connection to real time was the first crow of the cock. At dawn, each dawn represented a threshold, a gradual condensation back into ordinary space and time. Another element, transformative psychic or physical modifications, probes inserted into the brain or anus sometimes, objects implanted in the body. Similar phenomena are also seen in shamanic initiations. In our case, this process was not done to us. We were given instructions on how to perform this fourth dimensional surgery on ourselves, to use sound, mushrooms, tryptamines, and DNA to trigger a kind of metamorphosis into hyperspace, into hyperspatial yet still biological entities. Themes and elements of insect metamorphosis as well as alchemical transformation were prominent in our delusional experimental protocol. Secret or esoteric knowledge is transmitted. The contactee is shown books or golden tablets or technical manuals or computer-like machines. These are often instructions for doing something, for building something. In our case, I was given a protocol for performing the experiment, insights into a model of drug action that was nothing like what we now understand it to be, but that made a kind of crazy sense in the context of the experiment I was to perform. In the days following the experiment, Terence did not sleep. Instead, he began to construct the prototype of what later became the time wave, an odd quasi-mathematical construction based on the I Ching that he claimed described the structure and texture of time and could be used to measure the ingestion of the ingression of novelty into the continuum. He continued to elaborate, investigate, and defend the time wave for decades after the experiment. The time wave had the baffling character of an alien artifact. No one but Terence really knew what to do with it. And in the end, I'm not sure he did. One thing we did bring back, let's see here, another element of the alien encounter. The time wave was one, but another gift that we were given, or that it came to us through the normal encounter of events. Another thing we did bring back, though, were spores of the mushrooms. And over the next couple of years, we developed a simple method to grow the mushrooms, published a small pamphlet about it, and shared it with the world. This had real impact. Yeah, got it. As it opened these dimensions to consensual exploration. From the perspective of the alien invaders, this was the stealth weapon. And it worked. Mushrooms are now widely cultivated and easily available. They have taken over the world and formed symbioses with many humans. And most humans don't even realize it yet. That's the best kind of invasion. A quiet invasion. Okay. And then alien encounters often have an element of the absurd. There are funny or ridiculous aspects to the encounter. If seen, the aliens are little green or blue gnomes or dwarves or clown-like, or sometimes the scarier grays. Sometimes the saucers are straight out of comic books or debunked UFO reports, as if the aliens want to make clear that it's kind of a practical joke, all in good fun. And in our case, there were elements of the absurd. The immediate aftermath of the experiment at La Terrasse was funny, peculiar, and absurd, shot through with puns, silly jokes, and non sequiturs. At one point, I proclaimed that the script was being written by James Joyce. And later, Terence's encounter with the UFO, which only he saw, was another absurdity, because the saucer was a faked photograph of a UFO made from a surgical lamp and claimed by contactee and hoaxer George Adamski. And yet it manifested in the air in front of Terence. And then there are post-encounter confabulations, obsessive efforts to explain what happened, loss of credibility in the eyes of friends and colleagues, a vague, persistent sense of unreality. Things are not what they seem. And that was apparent too in our encounter. Post-encounter confabulations. Terence was shocked and dismayed at the skepticism of his friends in Berkeley when he returned from La Chorrera in May of 1971. So shocked, in fact, that he turned around and went all the way back to La Chorrera, only to be disappointed again. There were no more mushrooms. The magic was gone. He spent much of the rest of his life telling the tale, sincerely convinced that he was the symbiont and chosen ambassador of a benign race of extraterrestrial mushrooms or whatever intelligent beings were communicating through them, which is to say, who is to say that he was wrong? Just some of the background. My dad was anything but the average guy. He wanted to be. It was a post-war situation. He wanted to be part of the herd. He had had traumatic experiences in the war. He flew bombers over Germany. He had to bail out seconds before the plane exploded above him. He was profoundly affected by this. He was more bookish than most of his friends, though he would never admit being bookish, but he had a childhood illness, rheumatic fever, and he spent a lot of time reading books, often science fiction. And he discovered these Fate magazine, particularly fond of Fate magazine, which at the time often had stories about UFOs and stories about aliens and also about psychedelics. I don't have a pointer, but as you can see, the story here about the Peruvian soul drug, and here about the magic land of mescaline and the mushroom cults. I don't know if my father ever read these articles. I wonder. He must have. What did he think about it? Fate magazine is still published. It's still going strong. It's based in Minnesota. I was invited a few years ago to contribute an article on mescaline, which I did. And then the other thing, you know, the gift from the mushroom teacher. We brought the spores back, and soon we discovered a simple way to grow the little critters. Any 7th grade science nerd could figure this out, and many of them did. Dissemination of the technique opened the portals to hyperspace for many curious psychonautic explorers. Yes, there are unknown dimensions out there, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly alien. And yet life goes on. This is me, my dad, and Terence at my wedding in 1984. Life ends. This is Terence on the trail to his house in Hawaii in 1999. He passed out of this dimension in April 2000. This has been called the Devil's Paradise, the Putumayo region of Colombian and Peruvian Amazonas. This is where it all took place. Don't go there. Thank you very much.